Hello and welcome to Really Cool People, a podcast produced by Schweitzer Church. I'm your host, Jason Leininger. This is a place to hear stories of really cool people. And the hope is that as you and I listen, we'll be inspired, encouraged, and challenged through moments of serendipity. In a sermon entitled The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis said, "There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal." It's my joy over the next few moments to introduce you to somebody who may seem rather ordinary, especially to themselves, and yet they're a really cool person. Today, we're going to meet JoRita Steffen. She's going to talk about being born and raised on the campus of Evangel University for a while. She's also going to share about how her family spent some time in Texas. She's going to share a lot about how she was a wife and a mom and involved in the Air Force because her husband was an Air Force officer. And so what that life was like from base to base. And also, she's going to really share about some significant relationships that helped shape her life and speak truth, grace and courage into her life at some unique moments. So I invite you, lean in with me and let's listen to JoRita Steffen. Today we're happy to welcome JoRita Steffen into the studio. Welcome, JoRita.
Thank you.
Let's start with your story.
Okay. Well, I was blessed to be born into a wonderful Christian home with parents that loved me and grandparents that loved me. And I had a brother and a sister. And really, I was so thankful for my life. It was, we lived in Evangel College. It used to be Evangel College back in those days. And we actually lived on campus in those old Army barracks. So because my dad was a faculty member in the early days of Evangel. So all of us little kids would gather from those little barracks apartments in the backyard and play, and it was a wonderful thing. And so I had little friends, and everybody was there.
What'd your dad teach?
He was head of the music department at EU. I mean, it's Evangel now, but Evangel University, but it was Evangel College in the olden days.
How big were those huts, those army barracks?
Those little army barracks they were tiny, but back in those days, they were cute. They would have had a small kitchen, a small living room, and 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. And that would have been it. But that was pretty normal for people back then.
How did they feel like when the wind was blowing?
Well, they had the old-timey, you could hear the wind howl, and they had the old-timey radiators that you would... In fact, my brother got burned accidentally. They were so hot. You had to turn the handle on the top and they would make noise. And it was pretty wild, but it was just that radiant heat from the water heaters. But it was a fun way to grow up, though. It was, my mom would have coffee with the other faculty wives in the morning, and then the kids would all play. I mean, it was a good time. And my grandparents were in Texas, and we would go visit them every Christmas and every summer. And I couldn't wait to be in the car.
What did you think about being on campus with college students? Did you ever have any interactions with them?
Yes. Back in those days, families were everything, but that was like the ministry that my parents had. They loved those college kids. We had college kids in our homes. We went to all the sporting events. My parents would host cookouts and they would all be there. So it was just big gatherings of people all the time. And it was normal for me. I didn't know any better. So it was a wonderful way to grow up.
That's awesome.
So then, because we were at the bottom of the hill and they were starting to change things, as time went on, Evangel University, they began to replace the old barracks with the new buildings. And so then the faculty began to move off. But the last ones, we were still... at the bottom of the hill, they still had those, but I used to walk up the hill with a bunch of my little friends, and we went to Teft that was on Pythian. But then they redrew the boundaries, and not very many kids were left on campus anymore. And they changed, and I had to go to a new school. And in those days, you walked. My parents had 1 car, and, I had younger siblings that were 2 and 4 years younger than me. So I would walk to that little school, but I didn't know anybody there. So I went from having all these kids, and I was kind of a little chubby thing too, which doesn't help, but I was a little chubby girl. And so I come to this new school, and I had no idea, but it was kind of, the classrooms were overcrowded. I think it kind of grumped the teacher up. Here you have one more kid coming in. Anyhow, for whatever reason, I did not have favor with that teacher. And it kind of shocked me because it was the first time. I loved school. I loved everything about it. I loved learning. I loved music time, art time, recess, everything. But it was hard for me because for the first time in my life, I didn't have any friends. I didn't have anybody. I played at recess by myself.
Oh my.
It was hard.
What grade were you in?
3rd. And I was embarrassed too, because I didn't want to tell my parents, who had been so sweet about everything, and I didn't want to disappoint them. And it was like, what's wrong with me? Then one day I came home and I had, in the old days, you used to have S's for satisfactory and you'd get U's for not unsatisfactory. And then there were a few things that you'd get letter grades for, and I came home with C's, and I'd never had anything. I had some U's and some C's, and I'd never had anything except A's and maybe an occasional B. And I thought, oh, I'm going to be in so much trouble. But I remember coming home with that report card, knowing I had to give it to my mother. And I gave it to her, and I just burst out bawling. And she just scooped me up, I still remember, and held me close and just told me she loved me. And it wasn't that there was anything wrong with me. And then, of course, my parents were never one to badmouth teachers or talk bad about others. And, we respected authority and stuff. But I did know that my dad was going to go talk to the teacher. Well, things did get... the teacher wasn't so mean as she had been. It was just weird stuff. Like I had a long, beautiful hair that went down past my waist, and it was thick, and it was usually in a ponytail. And she grabbed my hair one day and said, "Why don't you just cut that hair off?" And I just can't even imagine. It was just, who knows? But it was funny. I've always been a little bit artsy-fartsy, and here in the 3rd grade, a bright spot came. There was an art teacher. They used to have visiting art teachers and music teachers that would come to the classroom. And so I had drawn and colored a picture of my family, and it just had my mother, my father, myself, and my brother and my sister. And the art teacher loved that. And in those days, they used to, every year, the Springfield Art Museum would pick, for a whole week, they would feature artists and pieces from the various local elementary school kids for the whole week on display. Well, I was one of only 2 kids in all of the whole elementary school. All grades, they picked my picture to be featured at that art museum. And I remember going and seeing that. And so that was kind of a real bright spot in a hard year. So
still have that picture?
I think my mom does have it somewhere. If I can find it, I'd love to see it. But it's been a long time, but it's probably up in, I bet my mom does have it. She has a few things. And so we had been on campus, but I told you how they were phasing out. Yeah. Well, my folks bought an old farmhouse that was out North National, almost to Green Lawn Cemetery. Back in those days, we were on 1.5 acres. You can't hardly imagine that. And because they were kind of wanting to move out in the country, and we'd had animals. We even had a horse, and there were apple trees in the yard. It was just so fun. And when I started at Little Fremont Elementary School for my 4th grade year, I had one of my favorite teachers ever. I went from a rough year to a year that she was young, she was beautiful, she was energetic, and she loved me. And it made all the difference. And so, it was just kind of a new thing for me. But for my 4th, 5th, and 6th grade years, every year they would pick one of my pieces to be in that art museum. So that was kind of fun.
Wow.
So that's
several years in a row.
Several years in a row. But you'd think that would be what I did. But I always sang. I always loved that. That was always part of my life. And so I loved all that. I love, even, I don't know what it is about maybe being the oldest of 3 siblings. It kind of makes you be the mother a little bit. And so I kind of mothered my brother and my sister. And I loved my family. I loved my grandparents, and just part of being a teacher, showing people how to do or what to do, was just kind of in my DNA. Of course, my mother, was a nurse, but she put that on hold until my baby sister started kindergarten. And then she was a nursing instructor. In the olden days, they called it Byrd School of Nursing, and she taught nursing at Byrd School of Nursing.
Where was that at?
That's the old Cox North Hospital.
Okay.
So they changed the name. That used to be Byrd Hospital, but they changed the name to Cox. Yeah. So anyhow, now I'm really telling you how old I am. But anyhow, teaching was in my blood. But we had summers off and every Christmas off because my folks were educated, and we went to Texas, and I was with all my cousins and all my, it was just a wonderful time. It was hot in Southeast Texas, and every summer we would, after lunch, and Mama, she could cook everything. She was one of the, I'd still give anything for her homemade rolls. They were with all the, dripping with butter and honey, and it was amazing. But she cooked these fabulous meals. And then after that, Mama and Papa would go have a nap in the afternoon, but my mom and my 2 aunts, my mom's 2 sisters, they would ride in the front of this old pickup truck, and all 9 of us grandkids would be in the back of the pickup truck, and we'd go to the swimming hole and go swimming every afternoon. So that was fun.
Did you go out on the public road to go to the swimming hole?
Yes, we did. And that's before seatbelts. And we used to have the tailgate down, and it was a highway, just a regular U.S. highway, and we'd have that tailgate down. And I can remember my cousin Vicky and Lizanne and I we were big enough to be, we rode on the back of that tailgate with our legs hanging down, and we could see the stripes going down the highway. So anyhow, it was fun. It brings back a lot of wonderful memories for me. So anyhow, that was my growing up life. And it was, something I would say too, is when the doors were open at church, we were there. Every time they were open, Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, we were there.
When you lived on the campus of Evangel, did you ever go to chapel?
Yeah, we would go to chapel sometimes, especially if there was some special thing there. But of course, I graduated from Evangel, so I went to chapel every day when I went to college. So when I listen to you just a little bit, it seems like you've got a Southern accent. Is that the influence of Texas? Is that probably yes? Because you can hardly get away from it. Well, I was born in Texas, and then when we were 3, moved to Springfield. But it gets in your, it just somehow just gets all the way into your bones, and it never quite leaves. So yeah. So then where'd you go to high school? I graduated from Hillcrest High School right here in town.
Yeah. And then from Hillcrest, you went to
Evangel. I did.
What did you study?
I had 2 degrees, a music ed and an elementary education degree. And I graduated I was the first person to have 2 degrees. And where I had separate ones, a BS in elementary ed and a Bachelor of Music Education degree.
How did you decide that? I guess you had the teaching in the background. The family is kind of like the family business, but
how did I decide that? So, sometimes I loved my family. I never went through any of those real rebellious years. I'm not sure. In high school, Dr. Sandra House, I was in musicals with her, and I loved she used to put on some of the best musicals in town. And I was the lead 2 years in those musicals. And probably if I'd have done what I loved everything about that, and if I'd have done what I wanted to do, I probably would have run off somewhere and tried to go be a Broadway music star or something, which is hilarious, which my parents would think that I probably needed to have a backup plan. And so that wasn't exactly encouraged, let's just put it like that. But probably taking on the music degree. I had kids choirs at church, and I loved that. And after I got that, after I was married, I taught in inner city Little Rock, and I had I didn't even know I was going to talk about that, but I taught in inner city Little Rock, and it was a magnet school at the time, and so they bussed in 80% of the kids were from the projects, and so they were the local kids, and then they would bus in like 20% white kids. So, but the kindergartners all got to be, they didn't bus them, they were all local. So it was pretty fun. I had 80 little kindergartners because I was the music teacher for the kindergarten, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. And all my kindergarten kids, there were 80 kids, and just one of them was white. All my kids were black, but I loved them. I mean, we had so much fun. And of course, being a music teacher,
You're okay.
I just clinked.
You're fine.
I had as a music teacher, I loved having all of those kids, and we did with the kindergartners, we'd just have little programs where the parents would come in. But with the 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, because I had musicals and had that training from Dr. House, we put on some pretty extravagant musicals. And our all-school choir, Dillard's department store down there, had adopted our choir, our all-school choir, and so they sponsored all the sets, costumes, and stuff. So we were able to pull off some pretty neat productions just because of that, which I loved. So that was fun.
How long did you teach in inner city Little Rock?
2 years, because I should back up and say I married my husband.
Yeah, we'll go back to that in a minute. But,
we'll go back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But yes, I taught 2 years that while we were stationed at Little Rock Air Force Base. We were there.
Okay.
We moved in January, and I had graduated in December when we married. And so that's coming in the middle of the school year. So I didn't start until the next fall.
Okay.
So I started teaching then. But that meant I taught for 2 years at Little Rock before we moved to Omaha.
Okay. Well, we'll go back to a couple of things.
Okay.
Because I've got several kids involved in theater, all musical and things. So you piqued my interest. You talked about some shows you were in while you were in high school. What kinds of shows were you in where you played the lead?
Well, I was Music Man. So I was Marion in Music Man. And then in Calamity Jane, I was Katie. So anyway, that was...
Do you like that?
I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved everything about it. So,
have you been in musical since then?
Not really. I've been a lot of, no, not really. I mean, I would say that I have used that because of my husband being in the Air Force and how many places we lived. The average place we lived anywhere, all while our kids were growing up, was 2.5 to 3 years. So it keeps you moving and keeps you rolling. So I would often have the kids' choirs at church and stuff, and we would do musical productions and stuff then. And I enjoyed it. I loved it. And anyhow,
well, it might be fun to think about doing some musicals now.
Well, it might be. Who knows? Who knows where
Who
we're going to be?
knows?
So, do you want to back up?
Yeah,
though?
let's go back to. I take it you were in college when you met Mike.
No, I was 16 years old
You
when
were?
I met my husband. And he was from Ohio. And I'm not sure you're going to want all this, but you can edit out whatever you don't want. That's all, but I'm going to back up. Okay, I'm going to back this up. So, Greg and Sandy Mundus were our youth pastors. But before they were youth pastors at my church here in Springfield, Missouri, they were youth pastors in Ohio at Mike's church. So they had this program called Bible Quiz, and it's where all these churches from all over the country, they are in competition, and you get, as long as you keep winning, you get to keep going up to the next level and up to the next level. Well, our church here in Springfield, my husband, let me back up. My husband was in Bible Quiz in Ohio, and they were doing very well, and they kept advancing. But Greg and Sandy Mundus had left them to come be our youth pastors here because he was going to AGTS. And so they were our youth pastors here in Springfield. So the kids in Ohio about had a cow when here they are getting ready to go to regionals and then nationals, and their coach has just left them for another state. So anyway, the kids up there asked Greg and Sandy, if we make it to nationals, will you coach us in nationals? And nationals were in Springfield, Missouri that year. So in Springfield, Missouri, the kids at Central here in town, they didn't advance they got knocked out like at state or something that year. So they didn't advance all the way. So they were already out. So it wasn't a conflict of interest for Greg to be their coach. So they came down for a whole week before. And Greg and Sandy said, why don't you, he wanted the youth group from Springfield to come out and support all these Ohio kids. So I went with some of my friends. We watched them and stuff. And so when I saw my husband, he was the tallest person I'd ever seen in my whole life. My husband is 6'8", and he was tall and skinny, and he was a basketball player, obviously. But I didn't think he'd even noticed me or anything. But they took runners up at the National Bible Quiz. They didn't win it, but they came in second place. So, but afterwards for celebration, they had Shakey's Pizza here in town. So everybody was supposed to meet at Shakey's Pizza. And I was driving a big bomb of a car. We always had transportation, but it was never very fancy. So we had a car that was old, but it was a big boat, which my parents said, that's more safe. You know, we like you to have that. So, but it could hold people. And so I just asked if anybody needed a ride. Well, several of the guys said, I need a ride. And Mike saw me and he wanted a ride, but this other guy got in the front seat. So he rode in the front seat and Mike had to ride in the back with some other kids. And he tells a story. He said he was going to, when we got to the restaurant, he's going to make sure that he sat down beside me at the restaurant. So he did. And he sat down beside me and we visited. And he was cute. He said, I thought you were so much older than me. But anyhow, I'm younger than him. I was 16 and he was 17. But we talked, we visited. And I like to hear him tell the story. He says, I thought you were a Spanish princess. So he was cute because it was summertime and I was tanned. And he said, will you write me? I said, well, if you write me first, I'll write you back, but I'm not going to write you unless you write me first. So he said, okay. So when he got back, Greg and Sandy Mundus at the time, they lived in this little tiny house on North National. I mean, it probably had 900 square feet. And all those Bible Quiz kids, along with their two little kids that were like 1 and 3, were all crammed into that little bitty house. They were on sleeping bags. They were just piled on one another, but they had a good time. But Mike went home and he told Sandy Mundus, he said, I'm going to marry that girl. And Sandy said, well, why don't you call her? And he said, I can't call her. And he was him hauling around making excuses. He said, I can't call her. And she said, well, I have her number because I babysat Greg and Sandy's kids. So she passed that number over. So Sandy gave him the number and he called. But my dad answers the phone, and that's when they used to have a cord on the phone. And my dad said, young man, it's 10:02. It's after 10 o'clock. And in this house, we don't take phone calls after 10 o'clock. You'll have to call back tomorrow. And then my dad went up the stairs and said, JoRita, some young man named Mike just called and said he wanted to talk to you. But I told him he couldn't talk to you tonight. He'd have to call back tomorrow. And then I said, Daddy, I said, he's leaving. He's from Ohio. I'm never going to see him again. You didn't let me talk to him. So anyway, Mike hung up. He tells it a funny story because anyhow, my husband and my dad are very tight these days. So anyway, so it's pretty cute. But anyhow, that's the way that ended. But Mike wrote me and I did write him back. And then he went to the Air Force Academy and I went to Evangel. We did the long distance thing that people think you can't do it and it won't work, but obviously it did. And the last thing Greg and Sandy Mundus did before they went to be missionaries to Germany was they married us here at Central Assembly.
Really?
Yeah. So that was back then.
Wow. So were you ever like in the same town dating for much of your time?
No.
Most of it was all long distance.
No, yes, but I will say this because my parents, he got in good graces with, we just wrote letters at first. But then after Mike's freshman year, that spring break at the Air Force Academy, he sent this ginormous box of Russell Stover's candy, a card that was like 2 feet high by 1 foot wide, and a dozen red roses. And because, so then my folks said, well, I think it'd be okay if you invite him to come visit us for spring break. So that was the first time he flew out for spring break. And then ever after, every spring break, every Christmas, every summer break, every break he had, Mike would fly into Springfield. And so I would see him for those days at my parents' house. And so that's that we did the long distance thing. But there's something about writing letters, though, that I think sometimes you get to know the heart of someone sometimes in deeper ways, sometimes just from the things you write on paper and what you choose to say or choose not to say.
Did you guys keep your letters?
Yes. Yeah.
You ever pull them out and read them?
Been a long time. But I need to find them. I will say this, like you asked me about the picture, as many times as you start to move, things get a little trickier and trickier on where you're putting stuff. And so keeping up with everything, although that's part of, I like to decorate in 3D. That's what my husband says. He says, you decorate in 3D, but I like to, when people come into our home, they say, I'd know your house anywhere, because even though every home is different or laid out different, I decorate the same way. I mean, it's just kind of an eclectic, stylistic thing that I do. And so I like it and I enjoy it. And part of probably, you asked me about I taught school until we had our kids. And then it was like, I realized that if I tried it for a little while, but I felt like I gave the best part of my day because I love my kids and I threw everything in it that I had into it. By the time I got home, I didn't feel like I had enough left for my own kids and my husband so we just made a priority, and I've never regretted it. I became really a stay-home mom to our kids and a helpmate to my husband, and really what I have come to be is glue. I'm the glue for our family, or
Mm-hmm.
the margin. My whole role, in many ways, that's who I became, is I am glue and margin in the lives of the people that I love and care about, including even now my parents, who are coming up on their 70th anniversary this year. So,
That's a pretty big accomplishment, 70 years.
it is an amazing accomplishment.
Yeah.
And my sister and I are planning a big shindig for their 70th anniversary. And so I think it's going to get a little out of hand probably, but it's all the kids, all the grandbabies, all the great grandbabies, they'll all be here along with. So anyhow, it's almost, I laughed. I said, this is like planning a wedding. We've got people coming in from everywhere. So
it's pretty awesome. So as you described being the glue, moving from once you start having kids and you realize that you need to stay home, what were some of the things that became passions or interests or things that you obviously decorating, because you've mentioned that several times.
I do love that.
Yeah. But what were some of the things along the way you found yourself like giving yourself to? And
I will tell you.
Yeah.
So church and the Lord has really been the center of our marriage, because it's concentric circles has kind of been a theme of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
So we have worked hard to maintain our marital relationship.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, you can't, or I don't know how people do it. God has to be the center of everything, or else relationships get hard. But when God is the center and you're not selfish, or you don't think of what's best for me all the time, it's a wonderful thing. But with the concentric circles, with God at the center, but then moving out in your relationship sphere, my next nearest neighbor is my husband. So I can't really be a good mom if I'm not going to be a good wife to my husband.
Mm-hmm.
Then from those relationships of being a wife and a mother, then I would move into the relationships even with extended family. And then, of course, in the Air Force, what people wouldn't realize is those communities are very tight-knit communities.
Okay.
And once again, I told you about how I grew up on campus. Well, here I was on Air Force bases everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't own a home. We would be in base housing, and our kids would be doing like what I did. You'd have this whole common area, giant yards, where the kids would play soccer and they'd play football and tag and everything else. And everybody has their little grills out there, and people just come out of the woodwork. And, we've always felt like God was the one that led us. You could say Uncle Sam gave us our orders, but we always knew where the orders really came from. It was God that led our path. He was the one that led us from base to base, from church to church, from the people that we met. And because we've met a lot of wonderful people along the way. And one of probably our biggest things is we wanted to help people. The military life can be stressful on families. And so that became a passion to mentor and help. And a lot of times it wasn't planned and it wasn't structured, but it would be my backyard neighbor, Scott and Pam Young. I've always felt like God places people in your life, but who would ever have known? But Scott and Pam Young in our backyard, she was a brand new Christian, and her husband wasn't even saved yet, but he was a B-52 pilot. My husband was a missile launch officer at the time, and we were in the backyard. Their kids were a little bit younger than ours. I think Ben, which was their first one, was 3, and she was big and pregnant with Rebecca coming on. And Michael and Caleb were probably about 7 and 5 at the time. And God brought her, and she decided she was going to be my friend. And I was just like, I don't know. But she was overwhelmed with motherhood. So she would come with the baby that was crying and little Ben, and we would just sit and have coffee and then I went to North Dakota farm auctions all over with Pam because she was teaching me about how to auction and how to buy stuff. And I love thrifting. I love everything about it. So it was just, we'd load up the kids and load up the van, and I would bring stuff home. One time I brought home this old antique sewing machine, and it had a mouse that had built a nest in the drawer, and it stunk to high heaven. And my friend Sharon said, "JoRita, what in the world are you going to do with that awful thing?" And then Pam, my friend, because she knows it takes elbow grease, but she just looked at it and thought, that's going to be a lot of work. But anyway, I brought it home, and my husband just smiled, and I got out the stripper, and it was fun. But I still have that in my house today, my little antique sewing machine, and it was probably one of my first things that I ever redid, and I still love it. So anyhow, I kind of went around the world in 80 days there, didn't I?
You did. But what? Did you ever bring anything home? And Mike said, "No, can't do that."
Do you know, I will tell you, my husband is a good sport about so much of that stuff, which is probably why I never minded being an Air Force wife, because I never minded being, quote, in his shadow, because he always affirmed me and he always loved me, and he never made me feel like I was less than. And he let me know that he appreciated that I was willing to be the glue, because I wasn't, that was something that's probably a little bit hard when you choose that, is because the world's not going to give you attagirls for staying home. You know, you're not going to get any plaques on your wall. Your husband may be getting walls full of plaques, but you're not going to be getting any plaques on your. But you know what? It didn't matter to me anymore, because I just felt like we wanted to show Jesus wherever we went, whatever it was, in every piece of everything we did. So we had people over all the time. Our house was always full. I'd have ladies' Bible studies in our home, and we'd have all the kids downstairs, and they'd be making piles of mess with the toys, just everywhere, and there's stuff to clean up. But it was just worth it, and it was fun, and I loved it.
That's awesome.
So anyhow.
You can build a life through many, many different kinds of activities. And that sounds like such a fun place, especially for your boys to grow up.
It was a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
So,
what did you guys do for vacations when the boys were like, when they were home all the time?
So this is another thing that would have been interesting, is we would take our time off. Mike had to take his vacation days just to see our extended family. His family was all up in the Ohio and Michigan area. My family was in Missouri and Texas, and we had to use all our vacation time just to go there. But see, this is the deal, is Uncle Sam sent us from sea to shining sea. So we lived places. My kids have, they've been all over. We've seen the Petrified Forest. They've been to Disneyland in California, on the beaches in Biloxi, Mississippi, and in Michigan. Mike was stationed at the Pentagon. You're going to Gettysburg. We always would take these day trips wherever we were. And then we lived in Europe for 3 years. So we saw all of Europe, and our extended family and friends came, because what better time, what cheaper vacation, European vacation, when we were living there in an old Gutmuchenrad, because when Mike was at the Pentagon, we lived 90 minutes out in a little town called Manassas, Virginia, because it was so expensive. That's the first time we ever bought a house, but there was no base housing when you were
at the Pentagon.
So that was the first time we ever had a house. But we chose Manassas because there was a train, and he could ride the train in that was 5 minutes from the house, because that beltway is brutal. And I knew he was safe. But that Mike was 37 years old and was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. So that was an adventure, being active. He was at the Pentagon actually during that time. But God was faithful to us there. We were teaching a Sunday school class it was interesting, because I really appreciate the older I get, the more I love it. I love a multi-generational church. I really do,
Uh-huh.
where all the generations appreciate one another, from the little bitty kids all the way to the great grandmas and grandpas, where there's not all this separation. But we were teaching family classes in Manassas, and essentially marital relational things like on finances, just on the stresses that people go through, the irritants that come just from life. And so we were at a large church there, and we had about 100 people every week in our Sunday school classes, but we loved it. But it was funny because we never had an age assigned to the class. So we had newlyweds, and then we would have people in that class that were 65 years old, and everywhere in between. Because you know what? The truth is, men and women aren't the same. They think different, and the things that rub you the wrong way it's kind of universal. And it was a great time. But we were in the middle of all that, and that class walked with us through that hard time. But God was so faithful, and I learned so much during that time. I'm going to back up just a little bit from that place to when my second son, Caleb, was born, because I think you can tell family's always been very important to me.
Yeah.
My kids have been very important to me. And I never really went through a rebellious time, but when I got to be married, you do make a choice. Is the God of your father and mother, am I gonna carry that on in my own household? And we did. And I had loved the Lord the best I knew how for as long as I could remember. And we were people of the book, and we still are. That's it for me. But little Caleb, when he was born, I remember when the doctor came in, because after he was born, I almost bled to death on the table. It was just a brutal delivery. And when he came out, he was 11 days past due. But I thought everything was fine. And they finally got me back to that room. And it's been like 2.5 hours, and they still haven't brought me my baby. And you're wondering what in the world is going on with all of that. And it just took forever. And then finally the doctor comes in and said, "I'm so sorry, but there's something really wrong with the baby." So we had to go to the NICU, and he'd swallowed amniotic fluid, and his lungs weren't doing well. And so it was pretty rough. So we had to stay in there in the NICU for like 10 days. And, his older brother's 2 years older than him, but he'd always been pretty healthy. But I loved my kids, both of my boys. And so after Michael was born, I didn't mean to, but we did. I got pregnant when he was only about 5 months old. And I thought, oh, goodness, it was going to be 2 kids really close together. So I wasn't wild about being pregnant right then, but I had a miscarriage of that baby, and it kind of devastated me because I kind of felt guilty because I knew that I didn't really want to be pregnant then. So when I lost that baby, I can remember thinking that I was so thankful for the live little boy that I could go home to. And the same day that I had that miscarriage and lost the baby, in our church, the pastor's granddaughter, they had 2 darling little twin girls. Well, little Amy was only 5 years old, but she'd had leukemia, and she died the same day that I had my miscarriage. And it kind of just pulled everything into perspective. You can either be bitter about what you just lost or thankful for what you have. And so I didn't spend too much time grieving or worrying about that. But when I became pregnant with Caleb, I was thrilled. But my favorite cousin, Vicky, that we'd always been so tight and we'd grown up together, she'd been married, and it was her first pregnancy, and she was pregnant with twins. And so, and we were due only 3 weeks apart. So this was all exciting. Well, when Vicky was 6 months pregnant, she went into premature labor, and the twins were born alive. One of them lived about 3 hours, and the other one lived about 3 days, and then they both died. And that was devastating because that was her first kids. So I had my beautiful Michael, healthy baby boy, and we had so much shared history together. So when I had that miscarriage, then Vicky had lost both of the twin boys. Now I'm in the hospital and the doctor's telling me that something's wrong with my baby. It's like, here we go. Here we go again. Mm-hmm. But then I can remember saying, Lord, you know what's best, because if he's not going to love and serve you all the days of his life, you know best. And I want to give you praise for this baby that I have right now. But the Lord touched Caleb. He got better. We went out, but he was always such a sickly baby. He was just in and out of he threw up all the time. They were doing barium swallows. He kept on having pneumonia. And in the meantime, we had moved, the Air Force had moved us from Omaha up to Minot, North Dakota, and he just kept getting pneumonia. And finally, the flight surgeon looked at me, and because in North Dakota, it's a region, the medical facilities weren't that big. And of course, up in North Dakota, even for Minot, there just isn't a lot in North Dakota. He told me that they suspected that he had cystic fibrosis and that we were going to have to be medevac to Denver to check him out. And I can remember thinking, God, I can't stand this. And I remember when I came home and told Mike, my sweet husband, he said, there is nothing wrong with that boy. He's just fine. And so that night he went to sleep, and here we are in our king size bed. He's sleeping soundly, and I am a wreck thinking I'm going to lose my son. And I thought, and he's just a little over a year old now. And I thought, God, he's probably 13 to 15 months old. And I thought, God, I just can't stand it if I lose him. And then this is the first time in my life that I had ever really had an encounter like this with God Almighty himself. But I was on that bed and I knew that God asked me, JoRita, if I take your baby boy, are you going to still love me and serve me? And I thought, I just wanted to push that whole thought just out as far away as I said, oh God, don't ask me that. Please don't ask me that. And then it comes again. If I take your son, are you still going to love me and serve me? I was like, God, I cannot do this. Please don't ask me this. I don't even know what's going on in my head. So then it comes back the third time. JoRita, if I take your son, are you still going to love me and serve me? And then I paused and I thought, where can I go but you, Lord? If you take my son, I think I'll lose my mind. I think I'll want to go in the grave after him. But Lord, if you do take my son, I will still love you and serve you. This peace washed over me in an amazing way. I can't even explain it. It is literally this blanket of comfort and peace just completely washed over me. And I fell into a deep, deep sleep. And I didn't even wake up for anything until the next morning. And it was just amazing. And I had no fear. I had no worry. And I'd kind of probably been a little bit of a worrywart my whole life. But it was amazing. And what was more amazing than that is that Caleb, who had been so sickly from that day forward, he never had anything. Michael might get stuff, but he never had anything. So that was so anyhow, and now he's a surgeon. So there you go. So anyhow, he's fine. He's got 4 kids. So Caleb's fine. Michael's got 3 kids. We have a wild story and a wild life, but God has been so good to us. Now I'm going to fast forward you back to, we're at the Pentagon. The boys are fine. When Mike gets home, they play because it was long days. This was something I did purposeful for our family and for our boys is, because Mike, he would be up before they would be awake or off to school or anything, and on that train headed to the Pentagon. And they were long hours. So he'd leave like 5:30 in the morning and not be home till 6:30 at night. But when he walked in the door, I knew when he left and when he was going to be on that train. So I knew about when he was coming home. I had supper ready and waiting. And then they would come in, we'd all eat together, and Mike had poured a concrete basketball pad in the backyard. So Mike and the boys every night would play basketball, and I'd just clean up and do the dishes. But it was a wonderful thing for them to have that father-son time. And people are like, well, didn't you hate? I was like, no, because to me, that was investing in time for them to be able to have with their dad. And I love that. So anyhow, during the middle of all that stuff, Mike got cancer, and that was a rough go for a little while. But the people at the Pentagon were so awesome. Now I'm gonna have another story for you. So, we'd prayed because we come from a tradition where I'd seen people healed, and we knew that God was able to intervene and heal. And so I kept thinking people had anointed him with oil. He'd been prayed for. He had this big lump on his neck, and I kept thinking that it was just going to disappear and go. And then you get up to the surgery date and you think, oh, well, they'll get in and they'll not find anything. Well, we got all the way there. Well, then they'll get in there, but it won't be cancer, And so we kept going down the road. And so we got there. Mike had the surgery. We'd gotten home. But they didn't say like that day, oh, we think it's cancer or anything. I just knew that they had found 2 large tumors and 3 little ones, and they removed his whole thyroid. But when we were home after that, it's probably about 10 days later, we get a call. You want me to stop? We got a call that it was cancer, and that C word, I mean, all I could think about with my vain imaginations was, I'm going to be a widow with these 2 little boys. What am I going to do? And so I was just devastated because I really thought, God, you hear and answer prayer. And so it really threw me for a loop. It threw my faith for a loop for a little while. But God was so faithful. I had a sweet friend. She was older than me, but that lady knew how to pray. And she's probably one of the first people that really taught me how to pray. Bonnie would have the women, there would be 50 women in her home for a prayer meeting. And it was amazing. I'd never experienced it or seen anything like it. But Bonnie and I had become close. And I wanted to talk to my mom. She wasn't there to say that. I only wanted to talk to my mom, my sister, or my other friend, Sherry. And none of them were home because I didn't want to talk to anybody else when I got that news about Mike's cancer. But the next morning, I get this knock. It's Bonnie at my front door. It's 7:00 in the morning. And she comes. She's never done this before. She's never done it since. She came in and she said, JoRita, I have a word from the Lord for you. And she didn't do that. So she came in and she said, the Lord told me that you're struggling with being thankful and grateful right now. And she said, you know what? This is the sacrifice of praise. You praise the Lord this is when you bring your sacrifice of praise when it's hard. Because she said, you know what? You have a lot of things to be thankful for. She said, you don't have to worry about the medical bills for any of this because they're all paid for. It was true. You don't have to worry about your husband losing his job because they were all around working around all this stuff. I didn't have to worry about the finances of all this stuff that a lot of people would be worried about. And I started bawling, not because, there was no condemnation in what she was telling me. She could tell me some hard things and some true things because she was my friend and we'd walked for a long period of time. And I knew she loved me and she'd never say anything to hurt me. Now, when she looks back, she says, I'm so, she said, I can't believe I said that stuff to you. But it was. She said, but I knew I had to be obedient to the Lord. And she was. And, I didn't feel the condemnation, but I I felt like, God, you do see me. And it was a matter of giving, just saying, Lord, you just work. And I watched as we went through some hard times during that time. Uh, Mike went from that to we adopted a baby girl in the middle of all this. That's a whole nother big story.
Yeah.
So right after he was done with the radiation and the cancer stuff and all that mess, we think we're going to get back to a new normal and everything's going. And then we adopted a baby girl in that. And then Mike is having, finding out that we're going to be having orders overseas to Germany. And I loved my church. I loved everything about I was not ready to go, didn't really want to go. And God was so faithful. Our house wasn't selling at the time. And we're getting ready to go. And my husband in that backyard that we've been talking about, we were supposed to be doing up all his woodworking tools and leaving all that stuff in a shed at my parents' while we're going. And so we already had the truck reserved. My husband's out hot dogging it in the backyard, and he goes up for, what do you call it?
A slam dunk?
A slam dunk. And he comes down and he lands hard and he ruptures a disc in his back. Yes. I should be a sweet wife, but I was so mad at him. He was in horrible pain, and I'm just angry. I'm so mad. And so anyway, I'm like, I'm supposed to be going to get our government passports to go overseas. You have to go all the way to the Pentagon. I didn't like to drive in D.C. I drove all the way around in the suburbs and stuff, but when we went into town, Mike always drove, and he would always be there to ride the subway and stuff. I didn't want to do all that. But anyway, I had to go in there. I got lost. Mike's laying on his back in terrible pain. And I think, and we're supposed to have our house selling, and our house isn't selling. We can't afford to continue the notes here and have rent at a house overseas. So it's like, God, we are in a mess. And I'd always been OCD about paying all our bills, not being into too much debt, all this other stuff. Had all my ducks lined up. So I have always been a little duck liner upper. I like my ducks in a row. But it was like I was trying to keep my ducks all together, and the more I tried to keep them together, the more they scattered. So anyhow, I get this call. You remember the story about Scott and Pam Young?
Mm-hmm.
I get this call. Hey, JoRita, we're in town. We want to come see you and Mike. I said, oh, Pam, we'd love to see you too, but it's really not a good time. Mike just has hurt his back, and we're trying to get the house out, and it's just not really a good time. Next thing I know, Pam says, we'll be over in just a little while. They come over, they're painting the house, they're doing stuff, and they know that we're supposed to be having all this stuff packed up. I get this from my friend Bonnie that I was telling you, my friend Bonnie.
Yeah.
She says, they have moved to Georgia now. So neither of these people are in Manassas. They're in Sedalia, Missouri now, Scott and Pam are, and Curtis and Bonnie are down in Georgia. And, oh, we're going to be in town. We want to come see you. I said, Bonnie, it's just not a good time right now. We have all this stuff going on, and it's just not good. Oh, and to back up, when I got home from those passports and I'd gotten everything a mess, my friend Sherry Jacobs, the boys were supposed to go over to their house. He was a builder, and they had all this stuff, and they had pools and horses. And so the boys loved to go to Sherry and Jerry's house. So anyhow, I go over there because the boys really wanted to be there. And I told Sherry, because she saw my face, she says, what is wrong with you? And I just told her everything that had happened. She said, you need to call people in your Sunday school class and ask them to come help you. I said, I'm not good at asking for help. I said, I'm not calling anybody. I'm not asking for anything. I said, God got me into this mess, and he's going to have to get me out. And Sherry said, JoRita, you cannot say that. I said, well, he already knows everything I'm thinking anyway, so I might as well be for real. And she was just like, you cannot say that. And then when I got home, so it was just me and my baby Savannah, my little precious baby, adopted baby girl. So it was just Savannah and I went home, and I went upstairs. I've never said anything like this before or since to my sweet, sweet husband. I go up. He's in horrible pain, and I have not been a good supportive wife, not at all, because I'm just mad that he's left me with, it's his Air Force that's making us move and do all this stuff that I don't even want to go. And he's upstairs laid out. He can't even go to the bathroom without crawling. I mean, he's a mess. I go up to the bathroom, up to our bedroom. And I said, I just feel like going out and laying on I-66 and just letting the trucks run over top of me. And then I turned around and I just left. And Mike was like, oh God, this woman you've given to me, you're going to have to just help her, because it was just all he could do was be flat on his back in a mess. And he just sent out a flare prayer. Well, that was when I got that call from, first I got it from Pam saying, they're coming over. And sure enough, they did. And then from Bonnie, they're coming over. So here I said, you remember I said, God got me into this mess. He's going to have to get me out. Well, what I wanted him to do, I wanted him to go heal my husband, help my husband to get back up on his own two legs. And then Mike can do all the man stuff he's supposed to do. But no, what God did is my husband was laid out. But these dear friends that I never even asked them to help, they came, they painted the house. Mike has this garage full of all this heavy equipment. They're packing it. We've got this big old U-Haul taking all this stuff back in this whole big U-Haul truck. Curtis went with me to pick that up. And then Pam, my friend, she says, JoRita, how are you going to get this truck to your parents? Now, you remember I've told you they're now at Sedalia, Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
I said, I'm not worried about it, Pam. I'll just figure it out. I just never said anything. Finally, she said, we are going to do this for you. And you know, who does that? They had 3 little kids, 2 German Shepherd dogs, their own car, and now they're going to also take all that and then drive. Oh, and we had a dolly of our little Stanza was going to be towed behind because we couldn't take it with us to Germany. So they just, it was God got me out of that big fat mess. And, you know, Curtis and Bonnie were there doing everything. It was, and I never asked anybody because it wasn't how I would have picked it, but he did a wonderful thing. And, you know, during that time, I was struggling probably with my faith, because sometimes you can think as a Christian that if I do A, B, and C, God will never let anything bad happen to me. But that's not really true. What God hasn't promised that everything is going to be perfect in our life, but what he has promised is that he will be with us and he will never leave us or forsake us. And I will tell you, I have found that to be true, that even in the dark places of our life, even there, God is with us and he is near us, you know, at the mention, he's as close as the mention of his name. So God, during that time, I was learning a lot of stuff. But by the time I got to Germany with this sweet baby girl, and Savannah was literally the best baby. The boys were so busy. They were busy. They were exhausting. They were just, you know, as little boys, they were good little boys, but they were busy. So they were into stuff. Savannah, she could have a little pencil and she could just draw little doodles. I mean, God knew I needed a good baby. So she was the most perfect little baby that ever there was. So God was so good. But when we got to Germany, and then I'm going to wrap this up. When we got to Germany, by the time I got there, I knew that God was real. I knew that he existed. I never had any kind of those doubts, but I didn't feel like he loved me very much, because if he loved me, he wouldn't have let all that mess happen. But then my sweet sister, you know, I don't even know why she did, and she doesn't even know why she did, but she sent me this book. It was called, by Barbara Johnson, Stick a Geranium in Your Hat and Be Happy. I read that book, and I read all the things that she had been through, and I thought, I haven't been through any heartache like this lady's been through, and it really convicted me. And I can remember just being in the dining room and kneeling around one of those chairs and saying, Lord, the Bible says that the joy of the Lord is my strength, and I haven't had any strength because I haven't had any joy. And God, I need you to do that. And I told you how I love to sing. Well, I sang in the choir and stuff, but I always sang around the house, just because I always sang around the house. Well, I hadn't heard myself singing. And then it was just like, I don't even know. It was probably within just a few weeks. I heard myself. It was so odd. I heard myself singing in the kitchen. And it had been so long. And the Lord had truly begun to restore my joy. And then here we were in Germany. And I didn't want to go. And that time that we were in Germany, we were in this big old, when we first got there, because the Pentagon was so far, I remember I had asked the Lord, please, Lord, would you give us a house that's closer to the base? Because Mike was stationed at the NATO Air Force Base in Geilenkirchen, Germany. And it was a rural part of Germany. It was a beautiful part of Germany. But a lot of people are having to commute in. Well, right outside the base, there was this ginormous, they called it Gut Munchenrat. They used to call it the Good Gathering of Monks, and it was an old monastery that Herr Wupperman had refurbished and redone, but the walls were like a foot thick, and then they had their side, and then it was ginormous. It was 5,000 square feet on our part of it, but it was like a barn. I mean, when you went inside, it was pretty rough. And I knew that I could do things to fix it up, but you don't have Lowe's and Menards and Home Depot. And it was like, what am I going to do? And then the work of it, my husband's back is bad. So projects, but I can remember thinking, oh my goodness. Well, Michael was 13 by then and Caleb was 11, and their dad was teaching them how to drill, and I was still decorating in 3D, and we ended up, that place turned out to be adorable, and it was one of our most fun memories. And we went all over Europe, and it was just, we did their church was different because all the Americans, we would go to chapel. And so we did a lot of stuff with chapel and still ministered to all the people that were in our sphere that God brings. And we always felt like whoever was in, those were our peeps. And when Mike was a squadron commander, his job was, if I take care of my people, they'll take care of the mission. And that was our job.
Yeah.
So anyhow, that was kind of, I didn't even give you a chance to take a breath. I'm sorry.
No, JoRita, I'm going to ask you one question, and then I've got a suggestion. Well, maybe two questions. Like, briefly looking into the future, what are you looking forward to?
Do you know, I still love spending time with all our kids and our grandkids. It's always a highlight anytime we can all be together. That's a big deal. But it's true. I don't feel like I love singing in the choir. I will tell you, the Schweitzer choir has just been a lovely thing. But no, I haven't really felt like we've found a niche.
So finding a niche.
Yeah.
Yeah. Second thing I'd say to you as a suggestion, that maybe you need to start your own podcast because you got stories. And you know how to tell them.
I don't know.
You got stories. And you know what? For your own grandkids, maybe it'd be a great thing to do, to sit down and record some stories.
I'd need help from
Taylor?
Oh, yeah. My goodness, yes. And my kids will all tell you, Mimi is not the most techno wizard there ever was. I'm a little technically challenged. Let's just put it like that.
Well, maybe your grandkids can help you out on that.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you've said so many good things, so many pieces of advice that are helpful and people can take things to heart. But just as kind of a final closing, is there a piece of advice that you've lived with, that you've received, that you find yourself maybe passing along to your grandkids or to your kids that you could share with us?
I would say always keep Jesus at the center of every relationship that you have. Keep him at the center. And then be people of the book. And then be kind to everybody that you meet. No matter who they are, where they are, be kind.
JoRita, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your story, your life, Your laughter, your tears. Thanks for sharing all that with us.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
All right.
I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
A big thank you to JoRita for sharing her story. In listening today, I hope that you were inspired, encouraged, and challenged, and that you begin to behold the really cool people who are around you each and every day. The Really Cool People podcast is produced by Schweitzer Church Springfield Mo. Taylor Likes is our executive producer and editor, and I'm your host, Jason Leidinger. You can help us out by liking, reviewing, and sharing this podcast. We would really love it if you gave us some 5-star reviews if you really like it. Thank you. And until next time, stay cool.